Welcome to John Bean audio story, where shadows linger, mysteries unravel, and every clue counts. Step into a world of trench coats and telegrams, foggy alleys, and ticking clocks as we bring you timeless detective tales from the golden age of mystery fiction. Whether you're a longtime fan of Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple, or the many unsung sleuths of yesteryear, you're in the right place. So dim the lights, pour yourself a cup of something strong, and let the investigation begin. Sherlock Holmes and the Candlelit Meeting at Mile End. Chapter 1. The Candlelit Meeting at Mile End. It was on a drizzly Thursday evening in November. One of those bleak wind-scoured nights where the gas lamps flickered like half-lit eyes and the pavements steamed with dampness, that Holmes first made mention of the Mile End affair. I remember the hour precisely, for it was 8:30, and I had just set aside a rather pedestrian volume of maritime case histories when our housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, entered with an envelope, thick, wax-sealed, and stamped with the mark of the Metropolitan Police. Holmes, who had been silent for nearly an hour, save for the occasional exhalation of pipe smoke in the shape of perfect rings, opened the envelope with a surgical motion and scanned the contents. I watched the familiar flicker in his eyes. Calculation, surprise, the faintest glint of curiosity. He handed the page to me without a word. The message was brief. Inspector Lestrade requests your urgent presence at 37 Penbury Lane, Mile End. A gentleman was found murdered in a locked room, the sole key discovered on his own person. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. One candle burning at the time of discovery. There is something altogether unnatural about the scene. Lestrade. I looked up. Another locked room murder. Holmes stood, brushing ash from his lapel. Indeed, and Mile End is hardly the usual theatre for such high drama. A locked room, a solitary candle, and a corpse discovered with the key in his pocket. Delightfully absurd. He reached for his coat and scarf. Come, Watson, Lestrade rarely invites me with such brevity. That alone merits our immediate attention. The rain had softened by the time we reached Mile End, though a mist still clung low to the cobbled streets. The gas lamps glowed dully, and the evening held that peculiar East End silence which seemed somehow heavier than noise. 37 Penbury Lane was a narrow two-story structure set back from the main road, its windows shuttered and its steps scrubbed clean. A constable stood guard outside, his posture straight despite the hour. Lestrade met us at the threshold. He looked unusually drawn, his moustache damp with condensation, and his hands still smudged with pencil and cordite. "I'm grateful you came," he said. "I'm afraid this one's baffled everyone." Holmes gave a cordial nod. "Tell me what you know, from the beginning." Lestrade led us inside, lowering his voice as we entered the narrow hall. "The deceased is one Mr. Felix Doncaster, solicitor, unmarried, lived alone in these lodgings for 5 years. A man of routine by all accounts, took his meals at the same hour, kept few guests, and spent most evenings reading or writing letters." "Cause of death?" Holmes asked. "Single stab wound to the chest, no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds. He was discovered slumped in his reading chair, legs crossed, arms at rest." "Peaceful then," I murmured. "Too peaceful," Lestrade said. "The door was locked from the inside, the sole key found in his jacket pocket, all windows latched from within, no other entrance to the room." "And the candle?" Holmes asked. Lestrade nodded toward the sitting room. "Still burning when we arrived. No other lights lit, and there—" He paused. "A curious detail. A chair opposite Doncaster's was drawn up close, as though someone had been sitting directly across from him." "Yet no one else was found?" Holmes asked. "Not a soul. No footprints but his, No signs of forced entry, nothing disturbed. We stepped into the sitting room. It was a modest space, bookshelves lining the walls, a small fireplace sputtering in the corner, and two chairs facing each other near a low oak table. Doncaster's body remained undisturbed, as Lestrade had promised. Head slumped to one side, eyes closed, the trace of a frown on his lips. A neat puncture over the heart suggested the fatal blow. In the center of the table stood a single candle in a brass holder, still flickering gently. The wax pooled, but not yet spilled. Holmes moved at once to the second chair. Remarkably close, he observed, crouching beside it. Within arm's reach. This was no casual conversation. It was intimate, intentional. He turned his gaze to the walls, his eyes darting like a man reading unseen text. No muddy prints, no trail in or out. The latch on the window. "Fasten tight," Lestrade confirmed. Holmes walked once around the table, then paused beside the candle. He leaned in, sniffed the air. "Lavender oil," he said. "Subtle, but unmistakable." I glanced toward the shelves. A candle scented for relaxation? Possibly, Holmes said. Or used to mask something. He turned to Lestrade. "And who found the body?" "A tenant below, Mr. Arlo Finch. Heard nothing unusual, but noticed the scent of smoke and came to investigate when the house grew too quiet. Forced open the door, found Doncaster, like this." Holmes crouched beside the corpse, examined the jacket pocket, and drew out the key, still warm to the touch. "Watson, you'll agree. Death must have occurred no more than an hour before discovery." I nodded. "Judging by temperature and the color of the lips, I'd say not more than 40 minutes. "And yet," Holmes said, "the candle has burned as if undisturbed for at least an hour and a half." He stood. "There is a contradiction here, gentlemen. The room is locked, the door unforced, the key on the victim. And yet, someone sat here, spoke with him, killed him, and left without a trace." Lestrade exhaled. "A ghost, perhaps." Holmes turned to him, lips curling faintly. "No, Lestrade. Far more troubling than that." He looked once more at the body, then at the second chair. "This is not a locked room mystery." He stepped toward the door. "This is a staged conversation." And with that, he vanished down the hall, already in pursuit of a thread only he could see. Chapter 2. The Solicitor Who Never Opened the Door. It was nearly midnight when we returned to Baker Street, the street lamps casting blurred halos through the fog that had thickened over the course of the evening. Holmes said little during the cab ride from Mile End. His eyes were closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that peculiar posture I had come to associate with furious mental activity. I dared not interrupt. Once inside our sitting room, he removed his coat and moved immediately to the hearth, stirring the fire until it gave off a more vigorous warmth. I poured brandy for both of us and sat across from him, my notebook already opened in anticipation. Holmes sipped once and said, "Let us begin by treating this as a logical equation, Watson. You were a medical man. Habit, pattern, consistency. Observe what aligns." I nodded. The scene was self-contained, no signs of forced entry, the windows were latched, the door was locked from the inside, the key found on Doncaster's person. "Excellent," Holmes replied. "And yet, someone else must have been in that room." "The second chair?" I said. "Yes," he murmured, his eyes glinting. "Pulled unnaturally close. A conversational position. Too close for comfort unless a shared intimacy or confrontation was intended." "And what else did you notice about the table?" I consulted my notes. A single candle, still burning. No ashtray, no second glass. Holmes snapped his fingers. "Precisely that, Watson. is a critical absence. I blinked. You mean the absence of a second drink? Or any sign of another's presence beyond that single chair? No coat draped, no hat misplaced, no footprints, no scent of tobacco, though Doncaster was known to smoke before bed, yet the air held only lavender. From the candle? Likely, but not exclusively. I suspect it may have been applied elsewhere. Holmes leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Now ask yourself, why was the candle left burning at all? If the killer wished to escape unseen, why not extinguish it? Or why not use the fireplace which was already lit? A message, I ventured, a symbolic gesture. Holmes smiled faintly. Or a deception, a performance. We are not dealing merely with a murder, Watson. We are dealing with a constructed scene. He rose, retrieving a small stack of newspaper clippings from the desk drawer. He had clearly anticipated this moment. I recall, he said, an item from the Evening Standard, dated 4 months ago. Felix Doncaster was involved in the controversial Blackmere Trust dispute. Legal quarrels over inheritance. A minor scandal, but enough to draw resentment. The trust involved several beneficiaries, all of whom had reason to dislike the solicitor's decisions. He handed me the clipping. Trustee accused of bias, potential forgery. Indeed, Holmes murmured, and note the name at the bottom. Complaint filed by a Miss Eugenia Kestrel of Sydenham. I looked up. A relation to the client. Number a beneficiary denied. Ah. Holmes tapped the paper lightly. Now, here is where our case begins to diverge from the merely theatrical. Lestrade, ever enamored with the how, has overlooked the why. Locked doors and keys aside, we must ask, who had the strongest motive to not only kill Doncaster, but to do so in such a peculiar, intimate way? He began pacing, his voice sharpening as the theory unfolded aloud. Doncaster was not murdered in anger. There were no signs of haste, no sign of fear. He was calm, legs crossed, a book beside him, a candle lit, which leads me to believe he let the killer in. I frowned. Then why the locked door? Precisely. If he let someone in, and that person left through the same door, the lock could not have been secured from the inside afterward, unless the door was never truly locked, I said slowly. Or, Holmes added, was locked by some mechanism we have yet to uncover. But let us consider the psychology. If Doncaster knew his killer, if he trusted them, or at least did not suspect them, then their presence explains the proximity. But their exit, Watson, that is our crux. What of Mr. Finch, the tenant who found the body? Ah, yes, Holmes said, his tone suddenly bright. Arlo Finch, a man of nervous disposition, yet oddly composed when recounting the discovery. Did you observe his shoes? I did. They were damp. From the rain, yes, Holmes said, but also from fresh wax. Wax? Near the candle base, a tiny spill barely visible. But Mr. Finch's heel had traced it into the hallway. Curious, is it not, that the wax was not stepped in by Doncaster? The print was too far afield. I stared at him. You believe Finch entered the room before calling the constables? Holmes nodded gravely. And perhaps before the door was broken. A witness who tampers with a scene is no longer merely a bystander. He paused and folded his hands behind his back. The room was arranged, Watson. That candle told a story, but the wax told another. I exhaled. So you believe Finch may be our killer? I believe Finch knows more than he let on. And I believe we are being presented with a murder not just meant to be puzzling, but deliberately misleading. He turned to me then, with the sharp glint of anticipation. Tomorrow, we visit Mr. Finch at his place of work. I intend to know what business connects him to Felix Doncaster, and why one man died while the other tracked wax through a locked room. Outside, the wind began to rise again, rattling the window panes. Holmes merely smiled. Locked doors are no match for open minds. Chapter 3. The Scene of Deception. The following morning broke grey and brittle, the kind of cold that rattles along the window frames like fingernails. Holmes, always invigorated by intellectual pursuit, appeared at breakfast with uncommon cheer, a boiled egg untouched beside his morning paper, and a small note pinned to his lapel, reading only, "Finch, bookseller, Fleet Street." "You've already discovered his profession?" I asked, surprised. Holmes gave me a slight smile. "Discovered. Number confirmed." A call to our mutual acquaintance at the Central Registry revealed Mr. Arlo Finch holds a minor partnership in Dallow and Finch Antiquarian Booksellers. The establishment is not far, and if my suspicions are correct, it may hold more than first editions. We made our way to Fleet Street just past 10. The streets bustled with newsboys and clerks, despite the sting in the air. Dallow and Finch was wedged between a tobacconist and a solicitor's office, its windows fogged from within and filled with neatly arranged rows of leather-bound volumes. A small brass bell chimed as we entered. The interior smelled of parchment and dust, the kind of air I'd long associated with libraries and forgotten rooms. A man in his early 40s looked up from behind the counter. Thin, clean-shaven, with the kind of narrow, over-attentive eyes one sees in cats and chemists. "Good day, gentlemen," he said with a nervous courtesy. "How may I assist?" Holmes advanced with casual ease. "Mr. Finch, is it not?" The man stiffened. "Yes, Arlo Finch. Have we met?" "Only in passing," Holmes said lightly. "We were present last night at Penbury Lane." Finch's complexion paled slightly. "Ah, yes, the tragedy." Holmes examined a stack of books without looking at him. "A peculiar business, wouldn't you say? Locked doors, a single candle, and a man you claim to know only in passing." Finch swallowed. I was his tenant. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more." "Yet you knew he was dead," Holmes said softly, "before the door was forced." The silence that followed was absolute. A carriage clattered past outside. Finch seemed suddenly unsure whether to flee or faint. I told Lestrade everything I know, but not everything you saw." Holmes interrupted. "There was wax on your heel, candle wax, fresh and uncooled, and the mark was found outside the sitting room near the hall runner. Tell me, Mr. Finch, how did you come to step in wax if the door was locked and you had not entered?" Perhaps, when I found the body, I didn't." "You opened the door before calling for help," Holmes said gently. "That is the truth, is it not?" Finch looked at the floor, trembling. "I only wanted to be certain," he whispered. "I heard nothing all evening. Not even the usual shuffle of footsteps or the turning of the key. The light under the door never moved, it seemed wrong. So I tried the handle. It was slightly ajar." "Ajar?" Holmes echoed. "Yes, not wide but not latched either. I pushed it open, and there he was, just sitting there like he'd fallen asleep. Only then I saw the blood." "Did you touch anything?" "No, I swear it. I panicked. I ran down to fetch the constable." Holmes regarded him in silence for several seconds. Then, almost amiably, he said, "Mr. Finch, did you see the candle already lit?" Finch hesitated. It was dark. The fire had gone low. The candle, someone must have lit it later. I can't explain it." "Someone," Holmes murmured, "or something." We left shortly thereafter, Finch's nervous claims filed away like paper in a cabinet. As we stepped back into the street, Holmes's features had drawn into that hawkish stillness I had learned to recognize. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "He lied," Holmes said at once, "but not necessarily about the candle." I frowned. "Then what?" "He claims the door was ajar. Lestrade claims it had to be forced. One of them is mistaken or deliberately misleading." I pondered. "If Finch is right, then someone left that room and closed the door," Holmes said. "And yet by the time Lestrade arrived, the key was inside Doncaster's coat pocket. Tell me, how would a man lock a door behind him and place the key on a dead man without ever re-entering the room?" "He wouldn't," I said. "Unless the key was placed there before the murder." Holmes stopped abruptly, eyes sparkling. "Exactly. Which would suggest that the killer intended the scene to appear as if it had been locked from within. A perfect locked room mystery, but only to those who believe the door was locked at all." "And Finch?" Finch," Holmes said. "He may be merely a frightened witness, or something more. He knows Doncaster well enough to enter without knocking, yet pretends otherwise. And he insists the door was ajar, yet also claims surprise. He is tangled in his own tale." A boy passed by, selling the Daily Chronicle, and Holmes bought a copy. He scanned it briefly before tucking it under his arm. "One last stop," he said. "Doncaster's place of work. A solicitor's secrets are rarely buried deep, Watson, merely filed alphabetically." And with that, we hailed a cab into the growing fog, chasing not a shadow, but the illusion of one. A murder painted in candlelight, where even the wax seemed part of the lie. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Holmes and I arrived at the modest offices of Doncaster and Lyle shortly after noon. They were situated in a narrow Georgian building on Henrietta Street, a quiet stone's throw from the bustling courts of Lincoln's Inn. The brass plaque on the door was polished to a mirror sheen, but a faint smudge of ash just below the keyhole betrayed recent anxious visits. Inside, the firm was hushed, lined with law tomes and brown briefcases arranged like sentinels on high shelves. A clerk with thinning hair and ink-stained cuffs led us without question to a back chamber where a prim and narrow man stood staring out the window. He turned at our arrival and gave a thin, guarded smile. "Mr. Holmes," he said. "And you must be Dr. Watson. I had been told to expect you." Holmes gave a brief bow. "Mr. Lysel, I presume." "Julius Lysel, senior partner, now that Mr. Doncaster is—" He paused delicately. "No longer among the living." Holmes wasted no time. "You were not close." Lysel adjusted his cufflinks. "We were business partners for 11 years. I knew him well, professionally. We did not dine together, if that is your implication." "And yet you worked beside a man accused of forgery not 3 months ago," Holmes said, pulling the Evening Standard clipping from his coat. Lyle's eyes narrowed. "That was a baseless accusation made by Miss Eugenia Kestrel, an heiress with little patience and less understanding of legal procedure." Holmes raised a brow. "Did Doncaster fabricate the documents?" "Absolutely not," Lysel said sharply. "I reviewed the amendments myself. The trust passed into the correct hands. Miss Kestrel, I believe, had imagined a much greater inheritance than the reality afforded." "And who did receive the larger portion?" I asked. Lyle hesitated. "A Mr. Lionel Astor, a distant cousin of the deceased patriarch. By the stipulations of the will, Mr. Astor was to receive the property in Sussex, as well as the shares in a colliery trust." Holmes turned his head slightly. "Interesting. And how did Mr. Astor react to this unexpected good fortune?" Lysel let out a dry breath. He appeared more confused than delighted. I must confess, I found his manner odd, distant. He claimed to have never met the man who left him such wealth. A stranger inherits, and the solicitor who finalized the papers ends up stabbed in a locked room, Holmes murmured. Remarkable how fortune courts misfortune. Do you suspect Astor? Lysel asked quietly. I suspect everyone, Holmes replied, until the facts align otherwise. Holmes rose and began to circle the room, eyes roaming over the cabinets, the case files, the filing trays in perfectly squared order. He paused at a ledger stamped Blackmere Trust, closed, and ran a finger along its edge. This was the trust under dispute. Yes, Lyle said. That file has been inactive for over a month. May I? Lyle hesitated. If you believe it will aid your inquiry. Holmes opened the book delicately. His eyes moved quickly down the column of names, annotations, and financial distributions. Then he stopped. Watson. Note this entry here. Miss Eugenia Kestrel, original beneficiary. Disinherited following codicil B. That would be the contested amendment. He flipped to the back of the book. A note scrawled in ink read, Codicil B submitted 14th August. Witnessed by F.D. and 1 E.C. Holmes tapped the initials. E.C. Edward Carrow, Lysel supplied, Doncaster's junior clerk, reliable if a bit slow. Where is he now? At home ill. The boy's lungs are weak. I believe he took a turn last Thursday. Holmes shut the ledger and smiled. I shall need to speak with him. One last question. Did Doncaster receive any visitors at the office in the days before his death? Lysel frowned. Yes. Miss Kestrel was here last Tuesday. She was volatile. Demanded to see the will again. She threatened legal action, but we've heard little since. Did anyone else visit? Lyle thought. Yes, Mr. Astor. The very next morning, polite but inquisitive. He seemed puzzled by the windfall. Holmes retrieved his gloves from his coat pocket. Thank you, Mr. Lysel. Your assistance has been most useful. As we left the office and stepped again into the winter sunlight, Holmes spoke at last. 4 names emerge, Watson. Finch, who tampered with the crime scene. Kestrel, with motive and fury. Astor, with inheritance and secrets. And Carrow, who holds the key to the codicil. And Lysel? Observant, evasive, but not yet suspicious. Still, we shall not exclude him entirely. I took out my notebook. Where to now? Holmes smiled. To meet Miss Eugenia Kestrel. But not yet. First, I wish to examine the second crime scene. I blinked. There's another. Not yet, Holmes said softly. But I have a growing suspicion there will be. Chapter 5. The First Suspects. The Red Herring. By mid-afternoon, a pale sun hung over Baker Street, its light diffused by a curtain of thinning clouds. Holmes and I returned to our lodgings only briefly, long enough for him to scribble 2 telegrams and toss them into a waiting boy's hands, along with a silver coin that vanished into the lad's coat with impressive speed. One to Lestrade, Holmes said to me, to delay any arrest by 24 hours. The second is to Eugenia Kestrel. We shall meet her this evening, but first, observe. He held out a small envelope, its wax seal already broken. Delivered anonymously while we were away. No signature, no address. The contents were brief, typed on coarse stock paper. If you value your safety and your reputation, abandon your inquiries into Penbury Lane. The dead disturb nothing, except those who follow too close. Holmes's face betrayed neither alarm nor amusement. A clumsy threat, I remarked. Typed, unsigned, anonymous. It tells us little. On the contrary, Holmes said, it tells us a great deal. First, that someone believes we are already close to something, though we have hardly begun. Second, that their nerves are raw enough to risk drawing attention by writing at all. Fear is rarely subtle. He tucked the note into the inside pocket of his coat and reached for his violin, playing 2 delicate chords before abruptly setting the instrument aside. "Come, Watson. We are to pay a visit to Come, Watson. We are to pay a visit to Scotland Yard. It's time we examined Lestrade's chosen suspect." Inspector Lestrade met us in a narrow interview room off the main corridor. He looked pleased with himself, which in my experience was often a sign of premature satisfaction. "You've arrived just in time, Mr. Holmes," he said, rubbing his hands together. "I believe we've all but wrapped this one up." "Indeed?" Holmes asked mildly. "And who holds the ribbon?" Lestrade gestured to the observation pane. "His name is Jasper Lyle, a former clerk of Doncaster's, dismissed 6 months ago for theft. Word from the neighbours is he's been seen loitering near Penbury Lane. He claims innocence, but we found a bloodied glove in his possession. Right hand. Matches the puncture wound." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "May I speak with him?" Lestrade nodded. "He's yours, but I warn you, he's a sullen fellow." The man seated inside the cell was lean, twitchy, and no older than 30. His eyes darted up when we entered, but he did not rise. "I didn't do it," he said at once. Holmes ignored the statement. "You knew Doncaster?" "Briefly. Worked under him. He was a cold sort, always scribbling, always whispering with that other partner." "Mr. Lysel?" Lyle shrugged. "I suppose. Doesn't matter now, does it?" "And the glove?" Holmes asked. "Planted," Lyle muttered. "I haven't worn gloves in weeks. Lost the pair in a pub. They found what they wanted." Holmes stepped closer. "You were seen near Penbury Lane the day before the murder." "I sleep rough in that part of town," Lyle said. "It's not a crime to walk near a house." "But it is curious," Holmes mused, "that you were dismissed months ago for theft, yet still lingered around your former employer's dwelling." Lyle's eyes narrowed. "He owed me wages. I was going to speak to him. Nothing more." Holmes turned, giving a brief nod to Lestrade. "Thank you. I've heard all I need." As we left, Lestrade followed, folding his arms smugly. "You'll see, Holmes. It's him. You get a man like that desperate enough, and he'll kill for coin or revenge. It's always money in the end." Holmes smiled faintly. "So Scotland Yard has decided already. We have the motive, the glove, the history. What more do you want?" "A pattern," Holmes said. "A mind behind the act. A locked room is not solved with convenience, Lestrade. It is solved with comprehension." Outside, Holmes's pace quickened. I struggled to keep up. "You don't believe he did it?" I said. "Of course not," Holmes replied. "He lacks the calculation. The murder was too precise, performed with silence, planning, and symbolic theatricality. Lyle is a bludgeon, not a scalpel." "But the glove?" "A gift," Holmes said. "Planted, as he claimed, and poorly. The blood was dry, brittle, days old if I'm not mistaken. We shall let Scotland Yard polish their red herring while we swim deeper." As we approached our waiting cab, a slim figure stepped from a doorway, wrapped in a long grey coat and wearing a netted veil. "Mr. Holmes." We turned to see a young woman with striking poise and deep-set, determined eyes. "I am Eugenia Kestrel," she said. "I received your telegram. I have come because I have nothing to hide, and because Mr. Doncaster did have something to fear." Holmes offered a faint bow. "Then I believe we shall have much to discuss." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. Eugenia Kestrel followed us into the parlor at Baker Street with the bearing of someone accustomed to conflict. Though not more than 25, there was something in the tension of her jaw, in the reserved economy of her movements, that spoke of long seasons under emotional strain. Holmes offered her tea, which she declined with a shake of the head, then took his customary seat by the fireplace. Watson and I sat opposite as she removed her gloves and laid them neatly on the table between us. "You believe Doncaster's death was no accident," Holmes began without preamble. "I believe it was the result of cowardice, corruption, and silence," she replied. "He ruined my inheritance with the stroke of a pen, and now the law will call it coincidence that he dies with no sign of struggle, in a room locked from within." "You accused him of forgery," Watson added gently. "I did, and I stand by it." Holmes folded his hands. "You claimed he altered a codicil in your uncle's will, removing you as beneficiary. Do you have evidence?" Her lips pressed together. Only the sudden appearance of a stranger, Lionel Astor, who had never even met my uncle, yet inherits everything. The amendment bears witness signatures I do not recognize, and Doncaster refused to let me examine the original document after the estate passed. Do you believe Astor to be complicit? I don't know. I've met him once. He seemed polite, if somewhat vague. But the real deception lies in how the will was altered and passed through. Holmes stood and moved to his writing desk, withdrawing a small envelope. "I took the liberty of requesting a copy of the amended codicil this morning from the probate office. I received it an hour ago." He unfolded the thin parchment and laid it before us. The handwriting was firm, slanting to the right. 2 witness signatures, F. Doncaster and E. Carow, sat in ink at the bottom. Holmes handed Watson a magnifying lens. "What do you make of the signature of the deceased?" Watson examined it, then shook his head. "It seems consistent with the one on the earlier trust documents." "Too consistent," Holmes said. "Note the cross-stroke of the T in Doncaster and the loop on the R. Identical to the earlier samples, unnaturally so." Eugenia leaned forward. "You mean it was copied?" "Not necessarily, but it raises suspicion. A man's hand changes subtly over time, even day to day. 2 signatures bearing precise matching strokes suggest either mechanical duplication or practiced forgery." He tapped the corner of the paper. "But this is not the true clue. That lies here." Watson and I leaned closer. Beneath the signature of Edward Carow, in the right-hand margin, a faint blotch marred the page, so light it could easily have been dismissed as a smudge or printing defect. Holmes held the page to the light. The spot shimmered faintly, revealing the tiniest depression in the paper's grain, almost like the end of a pin pressed against it. "What do you see, Watson?" "A puncture. But what of it?" "It's not from a pin," Holmes said. "It's a guide mark, one used by certain clerks when aligning carbon paper. Inexperienced hands sometimes leave such traces." He retrieved from a drawer a magnified glass sheet and slid it over the document. "And here, see these barely perceptible indentations beneath the signature of Edward Carow. A ghost signature beneath the ink." Watson inhaled. "You mean this was copied over an original?" Holmes nodded. "The real signature, perhaps Carrow's, may have been traced or rewritten atop another." Miss Kestrel's voice trembled. "Then someone forged it, rewrote the witness statement to validate the codicil." Holmes nodded slowly. "That, Miss Kestrel, is my growing belief. And the witness, Mr. Carow, is conspicuously absent, conveniently ill at home. Shall we visit him?" I asked. In time. But first, we must not alert the forger. The value of a liar lies in how long they believe they are undiscovered. Holmes folded the document again and looked at Miss Kestrel. May I ask, where were you on the evening of Doncaster's murder? She raised her chin. At my lodgings in Maida Vale, alone. I spent the evening writing letters, one to my solicitor, another to the Bank of England, regarding my uncle's holdings. You did not leave the flat. Number. Was anyone aware of your whereabouts? She hesitated. Only my landlady, Mrs. Winscombe. But she retires early and wouldn't have noticed had I left. Holmes studied her in silence for a moment, then smiled. I do not yet know if you are innocent, Miss Kestrel, but I believe you are honest, and that is, in our business, far more useful. He stood. We shall speak again soon. Watson and I must now meet Mr. Astor. Miss Kestrel stood and gathered her gloves. If you find proof that the will was falsified, Mr. Holmes, will the estate return to me? That depends not only on the crime, Holmes said, but on the courage of the courts. I can prove deception. But justice, I'm afraid, is often more elusive than truth. As she departed, Holmes retrieved his coat and cane. Come, Watson. We have traced the paper, the pen, and the plot. Now let us find the man who profited from the ink. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The residence of Mr. Lionel Astor lay off Warwick Avenue, a neat row house framed with ivy and capped with a modest chimney, whose faint smoke curled upward like a hesitant question. A trim housekeeper admitted us and led us through a well-kept corridor into a drawing-room furnished with quiet restraint. No ornate mirrors or boisterous wallpaper, only a piano, a single oil portrait of a grey-bearded gentleman, and shelves filled with geological specimens. Lionel Astor entered a moment later. He was a man of about 40, tall and stooped, with a scholarly pallor, and the slow, deliberate speech of one who thought carefully before speaking. He wore gold-rimmed spectacles and held a leather notebook in one hand. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. He greeted us with a gentle voice. I had not expected a visit. Nor had Mr. Doncaster, Holmes replied, his tone level. Astor's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, a tragedy. I've read of it in the Standard, an unfortunate business. But I confess I knew him only in passing. My legal affairs were mostly conducted through his partner, Mr. Liesel. Strange, for a man whose name appeared prominently in Doncaster's personal calendar the day before he died, Holmes remarked, drawing from his pocket a folded page. Astor blinked. Am I to believe you obtained Mr. Doncaster's private effects? With some assistance from Inspector Lestrade, Holmes said. Your name was written plainly. Meeting with Astor, 3 p.m. Did that meeting occur? There was a pause. Astor lowered his gaze to his notebook. No, he admitted. I had received an invitation to visit the office regarding a minor revision in the property titles of the inheritance, but I was unwell. I wrote to postpone it. Do you have a copy of that note? Holmes asked. Number. It was a hasty thing. Dashed off with a fever. I didn't keep one. Curious, Holmes said mildly, that Doncaster made no record of your postponement. He apparently kept the appointment open. Astor looked mildly flustered. Perhaps he hadn't received my message. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, then turned his gaze toward the portrait above the hearth. May I ask, why were you selected as the primary heir in Mr. Ambrose Kestrel's will? Astor smiled faintly. That question has been asked before. I did not know the man well, but we were distantly related through the Northwick line. I met him on only 2 occasions, both informal. Once at a museum gathering, and once when I gave a lecture at King's College. He took a liking to my work. Holmes turned abruptly. Your work being? Paleobotany, the study of fossilized plants. I specialize in early vascular flora. Watson, who had until now remained politely silent, looked perplexed. And Mr. Kestrel admired that. He did, said Astor. He was fascinated by ancient life, roots, sediment, cycles of decay and rebirth. He once told me that inheritance, like memory, should not be constrained by blood alone. Holmes made no comment. I had no expectations of receiving anything, Astor added quickly. When the letter arrived from Doncaster and Lisle, I was as surprised as anyone. Was Miss Eugenia Kestrel aware of your connection to her uncle? Holmes asked. I don't believe so, and I never had reason to correspond with her. Frankly, I expected the family to contest the will. I would have done the same in her place. Holmes gave a tight-lipped smile. How noble of you. After a few more pleasantries, we took our leave. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a cold drizzle had begun to pepper the streets. As we settled into our cab, I turned to Holmes. Do you believe him? I believe he believes what he said. Holmes replied, tapping his fingers against the window pane. A belief is no guarantee of innocence. He grew silent for a moment. Did you notice, Watson, the absence of one detail? Which? A single reference to the letter of inheritance. He said the letter arrived from the law office. Yet, when questioned further, he never once mentioned having seen the will itself. You think he hasn't? I think he's lying about something. Whether it concerns the murder or merely the chain of inheritance, we must yet discover. We returned to Baker Street by 4:30, but no sooner had Holmes removed his gloves than there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression uneasy. A gentleman, sir. Won't give his name. Says it's urgent. The man who stepped into our parlor was tall, with hard features and grey at his temples. He looked like a man perpetually unaccustomed to warmth, either in rooms or conversation. His overcoat was damp with rain, and his eyes flicked about the space like those of a man scanning for exits. Mr. Holmes, he said, you don't know me. My name is Franklin Lisle. I am, or was, Doncaster's partner. Holmes gestured to the seat beside the hearth. You are just the man I hoped to meet. I doubt it, Lisle said grimly, because I've come to tell you something I should have told the police. But I didn't trust them. And you trust me. Lisle's jaw clenched. Less. But I trust fear even less than that. He reached into his coat and drew out a small, crumpled object, a silk handkerchief, stained near the edge with a pattern of drying ink. This, he said, was left in Doncaster's study drawer. It doesn't belong to him, nor to me. But I've seen one like it before, on the man who came to threaten Doncaster a week before he died. Holmes leaned forward, eyes gleaming. And what exactly was he threatened with? Lisle's voice dropped. With exposure. Of something in Doncaster's past. Something to do with a case we buried 15 years ago. A case we were paid handsomely to forget. Holmes rose slowly to his feet. And now, he said, the crime grows older. And far more dangerous. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The next morning dawned grey and unsettled. Holmes had risen before me, an uncommon occurrence, and I found him not in his usual armchair but standing by the fireplace, pipe unlit, his gaze fixed on the curling ash within the grate. You slept little, I presume? I asked, stifling a yawn. Sleep, Holmes said absently. No, Watson. I let the night unfold. It was instructive. I fetched the morning paper, but found him uninterested. You have something, I said, watching him closely. He turned at last. Indeed, but not what one might call proof, only pressure. And in the right hands, pressure coat, were expected. Expected by whom? By the suspect who doesn't yet know he's being observed. 10 minutes later, we were in a cab headed east toward Mile End once again. Have you considered the peculiar arrangement of the study drawers? Holmes asked. I blinked. Only that the lower one had been pried open. Just so. And yet the documents inside, the will, the bank certificates, and Lyle's copy of the Kestrel account were untouched. Someone rifled the drawer not to steal, but to suggest that they had stolen something. A false theft. Precisely. A distraction, meant for Mr. Lysel or the police. But distractions are only useful to those who fear what truth might reveal. We disembarked outside a narrow public house wedged between a tobacconist and a pawnbroker. Holmes led us round to the alley behind it, where a row of refuse bins and a door with peeling red paint awaited us. He knocked twice. The man who answered was short, wiry, with a mop of silver hair and an eye patch. His expression was wary until Holmes extended a gloved hand and pressed something into it, a half-crown. "Ere now," the man muttered, "you're early." "Punctuality is a form of honesty," Holmes said. "Lead the way." We followed him up a narrow back staircase to a tiny flat overlooking the alley. The room was sparsely furnished, a cot, a desk, a kettle atop a gas ring. But on the wall opposite the window hung a curious item, a series of pinned handkerchiefs, all with similar silk patterns, like the one Lysel had produced the night before. "This," Holmes said to me, "is Mr. Elwyn Broder, a former clerk dismissed from Doncaster and Lysel in 1889 for misappropriation, and the man who, according to our witness, recently visited Mr. Doncaster under a false name." Broder sneered. "You've a long memory, Mr. Holmes." "I make a habit of it," Holmes said coldly. "What I require from you is not your guilt, which is evident, but your leverage. What were you using to blackmail Mr. Doncaster?" "I wasn't," Broder muttered. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then you will not object to our summoning Inspector Lestrade to search this premises for evidence of correspondence." Broder's confidence faltered. "Doncaster owed me," he snapped. "He made me disappear after the Velleman account scandal, said it would ruin the firm if it got out, paid me to stay gone." "But something changed," Holmes said. Broder hesitated. "Then, when I heard Kestrel had named a new heir, I made inquiries. I found mention of a hidden transaction. Money moved from the Kestrel estate years ago under Doncaster's signature. I wanted my share. He said he'd pay me again. But then he died." Holmes remained silent, thoughtful. After a moment, he stepped to the wall and examined the array of handkerchiefs. "All these belong to clients?" Broder nodded. "And this one?" Holmes asked, pointing to a black-bordered cloth with a frayed hem. "That came from a woman. She visited Doncaster a week before I did. Didn't give her name, but she left that on the desk." Holmes nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Broder. I believe you've just assisted a murder investigation." We left the flat at once, Holmes silent until the alley gave way to the road. "It was not Broder," he said. "No. Number. He lacks the finesse. And murder for someone like Broder is too final a measure. He deals in shadows and secrets, not violence." "Then what did we gain?" "A thread," Holmes replied. "And we are now in need of the fingers that tugged it." We returned to Baker Street, but Holmes was not finished. He sent a series of telegrams to Lestrade, to Lionel Astor, and lastly, to Miss Eugenia Kestrel. The replies came swiftly. Astor would arrive that evening. Lestrade had traced a document from 1890 suggesting a legal amendment to the Kestrel estate had been suppressed. But it was Miss Kestrel's note that Holmes handed me wordlessly. "Mr. Holmes, I believe I may now confess something I have long withheld. There was, in fact, a quarrel between Mr. Doncaster and myself 2 days before his death. I had threatened to reveal a letter my uncle once wrote to me, naming a different heir. But before I could, the letter vanished from my desk." Holmes met my gaze. "Watson, the murderer did not strike to gain. They struck to silence history. And as of now, there are 2 people left who may know the truth." "Who?" He leaned forward, voice low. "One is still alive, and the other may be hiding behind a curtain of silk." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. It was just past 8 o'clock that evening when Holmes and I returned from a brief but purposeful walk along the embankment. He had said little since receiving Miss Kestrel's note, though I could sense a sharpening of intent behind his silence, like a blade honed under breathless tension. As we entered our sitting room, Mrs. Hudson intercepted us at the stair with a note in her hand, her face unusually pale. "This arrived not 10 minutes ago, Mr. Holmes, by courier. The gentleman who left it didn't wait." Holmes took the folded slip, eyes narrowing as he read. He then passed it to me. "Holmes, you were right. It was never about inheritance. It was about erasure. I have something that may illuminate the matter, but I no longer feel safe at the townhouse. Meet me at the Whitechapel train yard at 9. Bring no one else. E.K." "Foolish," Holmes murmured, tapping the edge of the note. "But precisely what I anticipated." "You think she's walking into a trap?" "I think she has already stepped into it." He turned briskly to the fireplace, extracted his revolver from its hiding place behind the coal scuttle, and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Watson, we are no longer playing with misdirection. Whoever is behind this has decided the risk of exposure outweighs their fear of bloodshed. That makes them dangerous. We arrived at the Whitechapel train yard 10 minutes before the hour. The air was thick with soot and the distant clang of shifting carriages. A fog had begun to curl around the steel tracks like a thing alive, muffling sound and shape alike. Holmes gestured for silence as we stepped off the road, moving carefully between the rows of rusting cars. Our boots clicked softly against gravel. "There," Holmes whispered. A gas lantern flickered some 30 yards ahead, its flame barely illuminating a small signal shed beside the siding. But as we approached, it became immediately apparent that something was wrong. The door to the shed stood open, and there was no one within. Holmes stepped cautiously inside, his eyes sweeping the dim interior. On the workbench lay a parcel, an envelope weighed down by a small stone. Beside it, a silver locket on a black ribbon. Holmes picked it up, his jaw tensed. "The locket Eugenia wore the night we met her," he said. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first was written in a precise, hurried hand. "To whomever finds this, if I do not return, know that the truth lies within the ledger." Doncaster altered the terms of the Kestrel estate using a forged signature from 1889. I discovered a second version of the will and confronted him. He denied it at first, then begged me to keep silent for the sake of the firm. I agreed, foolishly, until I realized the ledger held more than I'd suspected. The accounts he buried may incriminate more than just him. The second sheet was a copy of a ledger page. marked with entries of questionable transfers, some to foreign banks, others to names I didn't recognize. But it was Holmes who spotted the final damning detail. "Look here," he said, pointing to the ledger's "Look here," he said, pointing to the ledger's margin. "That handwritten annotation. Hold for K.L. Kestrel Lysol," I ventured. Holmes nodded grimly. "Or Catherine Lysol. We must not assume it refers to Eugenia." Before I could reply, a sharp crack split the air, a gunshot from somewhere in the yard. Holmes moved at once, drawing his revolver and pulling me behind a stack of crates. Another report rang out, this time closer. We crept along the edge of the shed, emerging just in time to see a figure in a dark coat fleeing down the side of a rail car. Holmes gave chase, boots crunching on gravel, and I followed as best I could. The figure darted between the rail lines, slipping through fog like a phantom. But Holmes was merciless in his pursuit. He vaulted a stack of crates, cut across a shallow embankment, and tackled the man from behind with a sudden, brutal efficiency. I arrived seconds later, panting, to find the figure pinned beneath Holmes, struggling vainly. "Let me go, blast you!" I was trying to save her. Holmes wrenched the man's collar back to reveal the flushed, furious face of Lionel Astor. "You!" I exclaimed. "What the devil are you doing here?" "She's been taken," Astor cried. "I followed the carriage that left Penbury Lane. I thought it was odd. Then I saw her, Miss Kestrel, shoved inside like luggage. I tried to follow but lost them in the fog. I came here on instinct. I thought she might have escaped." Holmes's grip loosened. "Why didn't you go to the police?" he demanded. "They wouldn't have listened," Astor spat. "They think I'm still a suspect. I had to act fast." Holmes stood, brushing himself off. His eyes blazed. "She left these," he said, handing Astor the envelope and locket. Astor read them silently, then sagged against the rail. "She knew," he murmured, "all of it. And now, she may still be alive," Holmes said firmly. "But if so, we must act quickly." "What do we do?" I asked. Holmes turned his eyes sharp with cold determination. "We draw the killer out. They've silenced once. They will try again. But next time, Watson, it will be on our terms." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. By mid-morning the following day, our sitting room at Baker Street had been transformed into what Holmes wryly called a theater of intent. Every paper, note, ledger, and discarded scrap from the Penbury case now lay pinned, stacked, or splayed open across every horizontal surface. The scent of stale ink and candle wax hung thick in the air. Holmes stood at the hearth, eyes fixed on a particular document he had tacked to the mantel. Eugenia Kestrel's transcribed letter from the signal shed. I recognized the expression upon his face. Not rage nor frustration, but the deep, analytical stillness of a mind rearranging the furniture of a problem room by room. "She knew," Holmes said at last, "and they knew she knew." Astor sat in one of our chairs by the window, his coat still dusted from the chase through Whitechapel. He had not spoken much since returning, save to confirm that Eugenia had indeed visited the law firm the day before her disappearance, and had demanded to see a particular ledger that curiously had gone missing from its usual place. Holmes turned toward us, his voice low and precise. "We have been wrong about one thing, Watson. This was never merely a case of a forged will. That was only the surface, a diversion to keep us engaged at a polite depth." "You mean the motive runs deeper?" "Infinitely. Look again at the second sheet from the shed, specifically the accounts transferred to a holding firm in Rotterdam under the name Marcal and Sons." I retrieved the sheet and examined it afresh. That name appeared in the margin beside several of the larger transfers. And, Holmes said, it appeared on the shipping registry from the Penbury docks the night before Elwyn Liesel vanished. A Dutch firm, rarely used by English estates, unless they wish to obfuscate holdings. You believe Elwyn discovered something? Holmes nodded. More than the forgery. I suspect he discovered that a portion of the Kestrel estate had been systematically liquidated, quietly and illegally, over the course of 5 years. The ledger suggests a ghost company funneling assets under the guise of estate rebalancing. But it is embezzlement, pure and calculated. I sat forward. But to what end? Holmes picked up a different paper from the side table, a property acquisition list, half burnt from the grate at Penbury House. This, he said, shows that a parcel of land just outside Mile End was purchased under the name D. Marchant, a known alias for Arthur Doncaster, Miss Kestrel's late uncle and former trustee of the estate. Astor's voice broke in. Doncaster? But he's dead. Indeed. But before his death, he created a network of holdings under shell names. That land in Mile End was leased not to any tenant farmer, but to a man named Caleb Lonswell, formerly a steward in Doncaster's employ and, I believe, the figure Miss Kestrel saw at the candlelit meeting the night Elwyn disappeared. It was a theory no longer in the realm of conjecture. I rose. So you believe Doncaster and Lonswell were involved in, what? Some sort of laundering operation? Exactly. The inheritance dispute was a tool, a smokescreen, to distract from the greater crime, the siphoning of wealth from a noble estate through false debts and offshore transfers. And Elwyn stumbled into the truth. Holmes nodded gravely. Perhaps not all of it, but enough to warrant his disappearance. And Eugenia, clever and persistent, began tracing the same threads until she too became a threat. Astor stood, his eyes blazing. Then we must go to the police. Scotland Yard will... Holmes raised a hand. Number, not yet. The moment we go public, the men behind this will scatter into the wind, and Eugenia's fate may already hang in their hands. He crossed to the window, staring into the pale light beyond the glass. No, we must force their hand. If they believe we know only of the will, they may try to retrieve or destroy the evidence we have. That is when we strike. I turned to him. How? Holmes gave a thin smile. By appearing weak. We shall announce through controlled channels that the Kestrel dispute has been closed and the documents returned to the family's solicitor. That should draw out whoever remains behind the scheme. Astor frowned. And if they don't take the bait? Holmes's smile faded into something colder. Then we assume the worst and go to Mile End ourselves. He turned back to the table, organizing the documents into a smaller satchel. There is a man I must speak to, an archivist at the port registry, who may confirm the shipping documents. In the meantime, Watson, I ask you to reach out to Inspector Lestrade. Quietly. Let him know that we may require armed assistance within the next 48 hours. He paused. And one last thing. If any message arrives bearing only a wax seal, no name, no address, it must be brought to me at once. I agreed, though with unease curling in my chest. Holmes was assembling his pieces now, I could tell. The board was set. But somewhere out of sight, the enemy, calculated, watchful, and desperate, was already preparing their next move. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' grand strategy. It was with a sense of stagecraft rather than urgency that Holmes undertook the next 48 hours. The stillness in our rooms at Baker Street was deceptive. Beneath its surface, Every movement, every letter sent or word whispered was part of a calculated performance. He likened it to placing bait in a snare, not to catch a fox by force, but to invite it into a trap of its own making. That morning, Holmes had requested 3 specific items from Astor: an envelope bearing the Penbury family seal, a duplicate of the original disputed will, and a messenger known for his loose tongue. Astor had supplied all 3 by noon. Seated in his dressing gown, Holmes composed a brief letter addressed to the family solicitor, Mr. Hawthorne, stating that the contents of the inheritance matter had been reviewed, deemed inconsequential by himself and Scotland Yard, and were being returned to the family out of courtesy. He signed it plainly and placed the false will inside, along with a forged inventory of the irrelevant documents. Then, sealing it with the Penbury crest, he handed it to the messenger with a look of boredom, worthy of a man wrapping up a trifling country errand. "Deliver it to Hawthorne's office," Holmes instructed. "Linger while they open it. Mention offhand that it was returned by Sherlock Holmes, but that he is now otherwise engaged and does not expect further interest in the matter." As the door shut behind the departing messenger, I turned to Holmes. "You're certain they're watching the solicitor?" "Not certain," Holmes replied, "but strongly persuaded. Men who launder wealth on this scale do not leave threads dangling. If Lonswell, or whoever succeeded Doncaster's part in the scheme, is still active, they will have eyes on every legal channel that could threaten them." "And what then?" I asked. "If they take the bait, then they'll come for the envelope." Holmes crossed to the desk and lifted the lid of a small lacquered box. Inside were 2 vials of clear liquid and a lace kerchief folded twice. From beneath the lining, he retrieved an oblong silver object, small and flat, like a snuff box. "I placed a thin dusting of bromide crystals inside the envelope lining," he said matter-of-factly. "The kind used in photographic darkrooms, invisible to the eye but with a reaction to light and skin oil that leaves a faint residue for several hours." I frowned. "And you'll detect it." "How?" He smiled. "I won't. But Mr. Lambert, the chemist 2 doors down, will. I've asked him to prepare a reactive compound. If anyone opens that envelope or handles the documents within, the residue will betray them, even if they wear gloves." "And what if they do nothing?" I pressed. "What if they see through the ruse? Then we force their hand. By this time tomorrow, a second piece of bait will be placed." Holmes reached into a side drawer and removed a small pamphlet with a scarlet wax seal on the cover. "An invitation," he said, "to a private legal inquest scheduled at Mile End Library. We shall announce, falsely, that all remaining documents, testimonies, and ledgers related to the Penbury case will be presented for review. Of course, the event is fictitious, but I expect at least one of our unseen antagonists to attend. But if no one arrives, then we were wrong," Holmes admitted, though his tone suggested he considered the possibility remote. "But if they do come, we'll be watching." He left the room shortly after to coordinate with Lestrade, requesting 2 plainclothes constables to position themselves at the library entrance the following evening. Meanwhile, I was tasked with delivering the pamphlet to a gossip-minded clerk at the Home Office's bulletin board division, where Holmes knew it would circulate discreetly among the legal community before inevitably reaching the wrong ears. It was, as Holmes described it, a game of whispers within a hall of mirrors. By dusk, Astor had returned to Baker Street, visibly tense. His coat was damp with mist, and he carried under his arm a paper-wrapped parcel. "I followed one of Lonswell's known associates," he said, "a man named Carrick, who once served as a bookkeeper under Doncaster. He's been living in a modest row house on Enoch Street. Tonight, he made a rushed call to a printing house on Deptford Lane, left with a satchel he didn't carry in. Holmes opened the parcel Asta provided. Inside was a discarded broadsheet from the same printer, a copy of a forged deed, heavily redacted. "He's preparing false documents," Holmes murmured, turning it in the firelight, "likely in anticipation of a forced defense. Or," I said grimly, "a cover-up before disappearing altogether." Holmes nodded. "Then tomorrow must be decisive." He stood then, closing the lacquered box with a soft click. The curtain rises at Mile End, and whoever steps into the light, whether Carrick, Lonswell, or someone else, will step directly into the trap. I slept fitfully that night, my thoughts troubled not only by the danger ahead, but by Holmes' calm certainty. He had spun the bait with elegant precision, but I could not help wondering whether the fox we hunted was clever enough to bite the trap and vanish into the night before it ever snapped shut. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The sky above Mile End hung heavy with fog as evening fell, the lamps casting dim halos in the mist. Holmes and I arrived just past 6, well before the fictitious inquest was to commence. The library itself, an aging red-brick structure tucked between a public bathhouse and a disused post office, stood silent, its tall windows glowing faintly with inner gaslight. It was the sort of building that whispered secrecy merely by existing. Inside, we had reserved a back room, a modest reading chamber with oak bookshelves lining 3 walls and a single fireplace, now cold and unused. Holmes had arranged for Constables Billings and Arnett to dress as archivists, seated at a side table where false ledgers and copied documents had been laid out. Their purpose was purely observational. Holmes himself took a position in the corner nearest the door, his back to the wall with a book open on his lap, though I noted he never turned a single page. "I trust," I said, lowering my voice, "that you do not intend to speak at this imaginary proceeding." "I intend to say nothing," Holmes replied, "and listen to everything. It is not the meeting we seek. It is the reaction to it. If our quarry believes their secrets will be read aloud, they must show themselves. Paranoia, Watson, is often the most honest emotion." At precisely 6:45, the door creaked open, and the first guest entered. It was Mr. Carrick. The man's appearance had altered since the photograph Holmes had shown me earlier in the week. He had shaved his beard and wore spectacles that sat awkwardly on his nose, but Holmes, ever the hawk-eyed observer, recognized him at once. I, too, caught the stiffness in his gait, the unmistakable hesitation of a man who steps into a room not to attend, but to confirm what is not yet known. Carrick hovered by the bookshelf, feigning interest in a volume on local ecclesiastical law, but his eyes darted more than his fingers moved. Minutes later, a second figure entered. This man was unknown to me. Tall, narrow-shouldered, with a thin moustache and a small scar beneath his ear. He did not hesitate. He walked straight to the table, scanned the ledgers with only the briefest nod to the constables, and then took a seat in the corner furthest from the fireplace. Holmes leaned toward me. "That, my dear Watson," he whispered, "is Alton Bray." "The financier?" "Number." "The man posing as Alton Bray. The real Bray died 5 years ago in Tangiers under questionable circumstances. This imposter has been using his identity to manage Doncaster's shell accounts. The name's convenience died with the original bearer, but the network did not." At precisely 7 o'clock, a soft knock echoed at the library door. Constable Billings opened it, and in stepped Margaret Kettering. She wore a high-collared navy dress, a velvet ribbon at her throat, Her face was pale but composed. I noted at once the shift in the room's atmosphere. Even Carrick, who had until now only fidgeted with pages, froze. It was the reaction of someone who did not expect a woman to walk in holding secrets he thought buried. Miss Kettering made no pretense of browsing the shelves. She moved to the center table and, with calm deliberation, began to leaf through the false ledgers. Holmes stood and crossed to her side. "You are brave to come," he said quietly. "I had to see it," she replied without turning. If what I suspected was true, if the names in these records matched what I found in my father's private notes, then I couldn't wait another day. Holmes watched her with that half-lidded gaze I had come to recognize. "And now that you've seen them?" She looked up at him, her voice lowered. "I believe the man who calls himself Alton Bray had dealings with my father, not about the estate, about a shipment, a crate sent from Budapest 2 years ago under the name VG Instruments. My father mentioned it once, then never again." Holmes's eyes flicked to the imposter. The man remained seated, but his jaw had tightened. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a handkerchief. "Watson," Holmes said without raising his voice, "observe his right cuff." I did, and gasped. A faint grey streak ran along the outer seam, nearly invisible except in that moment when he moved beneath the gaslight. "The bromide dust," I whispered. "Precisely." He handled the envelope. Holmes moved swiftly, stepping to the false Bray's side. "You have something of mine, sir," he said sharply. "I shall require it returned. Now." The man stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "I don't know what you mean." But Holmes had already raised a gloved hand. "Inspector Lestrade is waiting outside with a warrant. I suggest you save your explanations for him." The impostor bolted. Carrick shouted in confusion, dropping the book he held. Miss Kettering stepped back as Bray, or whoever he truly was, made for the door, only to be met by the unmistakable click of a revolver being cocked. Lestrade himself had entered behind him, weapon drawn. "Evening, gentlemen," Lestrade said dryly. "Going somewhere?" The man froze. It was only then, as Holmes stepped forward and withdrew a folded sheet from the man's breast pocket, that I saw the final piece fall into place. Holmes examined the sheet, a duplicate of the Penbury will. "Just as I expected." He not only opened it, Holmes said, handing it to me, he tried to replicate it. But in doing so, he altered 2 dates, dates that form the very crux of the fraud. "One of them," he added, pointing to the margin, "is 5 days after the supposed death of the solicitor who notarized it, a man long buried at Kensal Green." I stared at the document, breath caught in my chest. "Then the entire transfer, built on a lie," Holmes said. Behind us, Lestrade moved to make the arrest. Carrick slumped in resignation, and Miss Kettering, trembling now, placed her hand lightly on Holmes's sleeve. "You've saved us," she whispered. "I only wish my father could have known." Holmes gave her a rare, softened look. He did know. He left the trail precisely where someone might follow it, should they have the will to see. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The events at the Mile End Library had unspooled with such clarity that for a moment, even I believed the affair had concluded. Yet Holmes, ever unwilling to declare a victory too soon, remained tense, his eyes fixed not on the man being led away by Lestrade, but on Margaret Kettering. "Watson," he murmured as we exited into the lamplit fog, "observe Miss Kettering's hands." I did as asked. They trembled slightly, and in her left she clutched a small velvet pouch. She noticed Holmes watching and quickly slipped it into her coat pocket. "She's concealing something," I whispered. "Perhaps a token from her father." Holmes shook his head. Something far more practical and, unfortunately, far more dangerous. We had barely reached the corner of Globe Road when a hackney cab, dark and unmarked, pulled sharply to the curb. From it stepped a tall man wrapped in a heavy traveling cloak, his hat drawn low. Holmes halted mid-stride, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Penbury, I presume," he said. The man looked up, and for an instant I thought we were mistaken. The face bore resemblance to the photographs we had seen of Sir Linwood Penbury, but it was thinner, more drawn, the eyes bloodshot and restless. He looked more like a ghost of the man than the man himself. Margaret gasped. "Father?" But Holmes stepped between them. "Not quite," he said. "This, I believe, is Theodore Drake, the actor who disappeared from the Royal Pavilion Company 2 years ago." The man said nothing, only reached into his coat too quickly. "Stop," Holmes snapped, "unless you wish to add attempted murder to the charge of fraud." Drake's hand hesitated, then came away empty. "It was never about the estate," Holmes continued. "Not truly. It was about vanishing, reappearing. You took Penbury's identity after his death abroad. You saw an opportunity in a man who was both wealthy and deeply reclusive, a man who could vanish with little notice, whose death could be obscured by paperwork and bribes. And with Bray's help, you nearly succeeded." Lestrade had caught up by now, flanked by 2 constables. The impostor Bray, handcuffed and silent, stood a few yards back, expression unreadable. But Drake was not finished. "You're clever, Holmes. But you didn't account for her," he snarled, pointing toward Margaret. "If she had kept her mouth shut, if she'd left the past buried, we'd all be free." Holmes said nothing, only turned to Margaret. "The pouch, please." Reluctantly, she handed it over. Inside was a small metal key, unremarkable at first glance. "It opens the strongbox at the Bray offices," Holmes explained, "containing the original documents, travel receipts, forged death certificates, and most damning of all, a signed confession by Bray. Insurance, I assume, in case Mr. Drake wished to disappear you too." Bray, from behind Lestrade's shoulder, turned ashen. "I never wrote." Holmes held up a hand. "Oh, but you did, or rather someone with your handwriting did, and you were foolish enough to file the drafts in your own ledger, assuming no one would find them." Drake lunged. It happened so quickly that had I not been watching Holmes at that very moment, I might have missed it entirely. The man shot forward, drawing a blade from inside his boot, aiming not for Holmes, but for Margaret. Holmes moved with astonishing swiftness, deflecting the blade with the handle of his walking cane. Margaret staggered back, crying out, but was unharmed. Lestrade and the constables pounced on Drake and wrestled him to the ground. "Remarkably theatrical," Holmes muttered, adjusting his collar, though one expects no less from a stage professional. Margaret was pale, visibly shaken. I stepped forward to support her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he kill me?" Holmes turned to her, more gently now. "Because you knew the one thing he could not hide. The ring." She blinked. "The ring?" Holmes nodded. "The mourning band your father wore, black agate with a hair inlay. You mentioned it to me in your first visit, describing it in detail. Drake, posing as your father, did not know to wear it. It was a small omission, but to you, it marked the difference between a memory and a mask." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Holmes glanced at the constables, who were loading Drake into the cab behind Bray. "Do not be. Your instinct for truth is what led us here." Lestrade gave Holmes a begrudging nod. "That was too close, Holmes." "As I suspected it would be," Holmes replied. "A man desperate enough to steal a life is desperate enough to fight to keep it." We stood there for a moment, the fog curling around our feet like smoke, the gas lamps swaying above in the slight breeze. Then Holmes turned to me. "We have one final matter to settle, Watson. I believe the solicitor's clerk who notarized the false documents, Mr. Giles, is not as dead as reported. I have a suspicion he may soon be seen catching a steamer from Dover." "And how do you know that?" Holmes smiled. "Because I sent him the ticket." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The fog had thickened by the time we returned to Baker Street that evening, curling through the lamplight like a living thing. Holmes had been unusually silent during the cab ride, his hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on some point far beyond the window. I knew better than to interrupt when he was in that mode, and so we rode in thoughtful silence, the tension still clinging to us after Drake's final, desperate act. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a mild look of concern and a pot of hot tea already waiting. Holmes barely touched his cup. He sat down in his chair with the quiet deliberation of a man fitting the last pieces of a puzzle into place. "You still have questions," I said, finally breaking the silence. Holmes looked up, his expression unreadable. "One does not lay a trap unless one is quite certain all the players are accounted for, and I am not yet certain." I set my cup down carefully. "Then you believe someone is still unaccounted for?" "Not someone," he said, standing suddenly. "Something." He crossed the room and opened a small wooden cabinet containing clippings, correspondence, and maps. From within he pulled a thin, folded parchment and laid it on the table. I stood beside him. It was a copy of the Mile End Library's architectural plans. "Do you recall the iron grate behind the librarian's desk?" Holmes asked. "Vaguely. It seemed to serve no clear purpose." "Precisely. And yet it was newly bolted, despite the rest of the structure dating back over half a century. The design suggested it once connected to an old coal chute." He tapped a section labeled Sub-Cellar B, partially sealed in the current floor plan. "A tunnel?" I asked. "Indeed, one that leads to the back alley behind Bray and Penbury's offices." It was then I understood. That's how Drake moved between the two buildings without being seen. He never needed to enter or exit through the front doors. And that's how Bray managed to deliver correspondence without leaving any trace. Holmes nodded. "They created a passage through which forged documents, disguises, and even Drake himself could be moved undetected. But there's more." He paced the room, voice growing firmer. "Giles, the solicitor's clerk whom we believed dead, was not silenced immediately. In fact, he worked with them for several weeks after Penbury's assumed death, preparing the estate's transfer and forging the required testimonies. Then he vanished. Bray claimed it was suicide, but the body was never recovered, and there was no inquest." "And you believe he's still alive?" Holmes smiled faintly. "He is booked on the Calais packet tomorrow under the name George Altham. I confirmed it using a fabricated inquiry from a supposed solicitor requesting travel papers. The handwriting on the reply matched the one used in the forged codicil to Penbury's will." I felt a chill. "So the final proof lies with Giles?" Holmes nodded. "And I intend to obtain it." Before I could ask how, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram in hand. Holmes took it, scanned the contents, and handed it to me. 2. Sherlock Holmes stopped man at Dover port. Matches your description. Claims to be Giles awaiting your instructions. Lestrade. Holmes turned toward the window. It is time. We arrived at Dover just after midnight. The harbour lights glimmered in the distance as the sea tossed under a pale moon. At the customs post, Lestrade waited with his usual impatience, and a man seated on a wooden bench between two constables. The man was thin, dishevelled, and poorly dressed, but his eyes were keen and alert. He looked up as Holmes approached and flinched. "Mr. Giles," Holmes said evenly, "you nearly escaped." Giles said nothing. "I have little interest in punishment," Holmes continued, "only in truth. Help us expose the men who manipulated you, and I'll ensure leniency from the courts." Still no reply. Holmes stepped closer. "They meant to kill you eventually, just as they nearly killed Miss Kettering. You are a liability to them, Mr. Giles, but to us, you are a witness." Something flickered in the man's face. "I didn't know they'd go that far," he muttered. "I thought it was just money, just documents." Holmes gestured subtly, and Lestrade nodded. One of the constables loosened Giles's cuffs. "They told me Penbury had died in a fever abroad," Giles continued. "Said they were fulfilling his last wishes, making sure the will passed without scrutiny. I notarized everything. I even signed the confession Bray wrote, just in case. He kept it locked in his safe." Watson and I exchanged glances. "The one we retrieved from the pouch," Holmes nodded. "That was the copy, but now we have the man who wrote it." Giles sighed. "They forged the identity, the travel papers, even built that tunnel between the library and Bray's back room. It was Bray's idea. He used the passage to smuggle the actor in and out for months before anyone suspected." "And the ring?" I asked. Giles looked puzzled. "The mourning ring Penbury always wore," I explained. "Drake didn't have it." Giles shook his head. "They sold it weeks ago, pawned it under the name Hector Plymley, and thought no one would notice." Holmes smiled thinly, but someone did. We returned to Baker Street before dawn, weary but satisfied. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the first grey tinge of morning. Holmes poured himself a glass of claret and sat by the fire. "One must admire the thoroughness of their deceit," he said. "Had Miss Kettering not come to us, had the mourning ring not been missing, it might have worked." "But you never believed it," I said. "No," Holmes admitted. "From the moment I saw the signature on the forged will, I knew something was wrong." Penbury's hand trembled only when he was writing personal letters, but the document was executed in a confident, unbroken line. That was not the stroke of a dying man. It was the stroke of a forger with time on his hands. He leaned back and closed his eyes. "And now," he murmured, "the game begins its end." Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was a bitter morning, the sort that seemed to harden the very air with its stillness. The sort I've often thought that suits my friend Sherlock Holmes best. There was a curious tension in him that day, subdued yet unmistakably present. As he stood at the hearth, the morning edition of the Times folded precisely beside him. He had arranged the meeting at the Mile End Library, not out of sentiment, but because, as he put it, a performance must end upon the same stage on which it began. Holmes, I have learned, cares more for symmetry than theatre, though the result is often indistinguishable. "Are you ready, Watson?" he asked, buttoning his overcoat. "As ever," I replied. By 10:30, the central reading room had been closed to the public and prepared to receive guests of a rather different sort. The shelves, tall and brooding, loomed over the gathering like ancient spectators. The gaslights flickered faintly in the gloom. casting long shadows that crawled along the walls. It was in this muted hush that the players arrived, wanted first, eyes sharp, back straight, a quiet resolve in every step. Behind her came Mr. Elwood, the assistant librarian, looking uncomfortably out of place in a setting devoid of books. His eyes flickered to the shuttered windows, as if calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Then came Mr. Bray. He moved with his usual smoothness, every line of his person tailored and composed. But there was a tightness at the corners of his mouth, and a flick of his eyes that betrayed a crack in his polished veneer. He greeted Holmes with a shallow nod, but said nothing. Inspector Lestrade arrived last, accompanied by Giles, the recently detained solicitor's clerk, whose pale complexion and nervous fingers revealed the strain of the past days. Giles avoided Bray's gaze entirely. Holmes stood at the center of the room, the long table between him and his assembled audience. "I thank you all for coming," he said, his tone level but firm. "We are here not for ceremony, but for clarity. Certain shadows must be dispelled." Bray crossed his arms. "If this is about Mr. Penbury's estate, it is about far more than that." Holmes interrupted. "A man was murdered, a woman nearly so. A fortune was almost stolen through the careful manipulation of truth, appearance, and time. But time, as ever, leaves clues." He gestured toward Giles. "This man, until recently presumed missing or dead, worked under the direct supervision of Mr. Bray in the preparation of forged legal documents. These documents bore the forged signature of the late Henry Penbury and named Drake, not his cousin, but an actor recruited and disguised by Bray as his rightful heir." Bray let out a derisive breath. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes, and entirely without proof." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary," he said, "the actor has already confessed. Though under the alias Drake his real name is Cecil Merriweather, he has been apprehended. The ring he wore, supposedly a family heirloom, was traced to a pawnbroker in Bermondsey. The handwriting on the forged codicil matched that of Giles, acting under your instructions." Bray's face had gone a shade paler, but he remained silent. "You anticipated scrutiny," Holmes continued. "So you constructed a second passage, through the sub-cellar of this very library. You used it to move materials, people, and secrets in and out, undetected. You even employed Elwood here to ensure no one stumbled upon it." Elwood gave a startled jolt. I never." Holmes held up a hand. "You may not have understood the full extent of your complicity, Mr. Elwood, but your job was to ensure that Miss Kettering's access was limited, her presence monitored, and that the rear records room remained inaccessible." A long silence followed. Then Holmes stepped around the table, voice softening. "Miss Kettering, your suspicions saved this case from vanishing into obscurity. It was the mourning ring that did it. That small detail spoke louder than a dozen testimonies. A man like Penbury would never have parted with it, not in life, not in death. Yet it was missing from Drake's hand, and found instead among the possessions of Merriweather." Bray turned sharply. "He must have stolen it." "Perhaps," Holmes replied mildly, "but only after you sold it, Mr. Bray." Holmes moved to the window and drew back the curtain, revealing two uniformed officers outside. He gave a small nod. Lestrade stepped forward. "Mr. Lionel Bray," he said, "you are hereby under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, forgery, and the attempted murder of Miss Clara Kettering. You will come with us." Bray opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Then, with a strange finality, he straightened his collar and offered Holmes the faintest of smiles. "Well played," he said softly. He walked toward the door, flanked by officers, never once looking back. Miss Kettering let out a breath she had been holding. Elwood sat down heavily, staring at the floor. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Ensure the tunnel is sealed and the documents archived. I suspect more threads will emerge in the coming weeks." As the room emptied, I remained behind with Holmes. "You never mentioned the letter," I said. "The letter Miss Kettering brought," Holmes replied. "Yes, you said it was crucial." Holmes smiled faintly. "It was a test. I needed to see whether her instincts were sound. They were. And so we followed the trail." He stepped into the empty corridor, the echo of footsteps chasing his words. "There is nothing quite as dangerous," he murmured, "as a man who believes he can outwit consequence." Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. It was late in the day by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The London dusk had settled into a pale, ashen hue outside the windows, the fog curling along the eaves like some ancient whisper returning home. Mrs. Hudson had laid a tray of tea for us, though Holmes touched nothing. He stood by the hearth, steepling his fingers before his face, his eyes half closed as though reliving the entire case in sequence, backwards and forwards. "I suppose," I began, "that now the matter is closed, you will permit me a complete explanation." Holmes opened one eye. "My dear Watson, if it were ever truly closed, I should be most alarmed. But let us suppose for your sake that we are merely a few steps ahead of the game." I settled into the armchair with my notebook. "Then kindly begin from the beginning, this time without enigmas." He smiled faintly, then began. "From the moment Miss Kettering arrived on our doorstep, I suspected deception, not from her but around her. Her late employer, Henry Penbury, was a man of great means, but reclusive disposition. His death was natural, or so we were meant to believe. At the sudden emergence of a so-called heir, this Mr. Drake, without clear documentation, struck me as too abrupt, too clean. When she presented the codicil naming Drake as Penbury's heir, I immediately questioned its authenticity. Handwriting inconsistencies were minor, but the ink had not aged as it should. A forgery, recent and deliberate. He stood now, pacing slowly. But the question was, why would someone go through such lengths to fabricate a will, and more importantly, who had the skill and access to accomplish it? We then met Mr. Lionel Bray, a solicitor of fine reputation and unblemished manner. He had every appearance of disinterest in the inheritance itself, and yet every road seemed to bend subtly in his direction. He was the executor, the intermediary, the one who introduced Drake to the estate, and the keeper of the original will. Too many coincidences for my liking. Holmes tapped his temple lightly. And then came the crime at the library, a candlelit rendezvous in a locked reading room with no sign of forced entry and a witness nearly murdered. Miss Kettering, fortunately, was resilient enough to survive the attack, though she could not identify her assailant. It was then that I suspected the library itself held secrets, quite literally below the surface. "You mean the tunnel?" I asked. "Precisely. Libraries are curious structures, Watson, built layer upon layer. It is not uncommon for older foundations to contain unused cellars, or in this case, a forgotten passage. Our dear Mr. Elwood, while complicit, was likely unaware of its full history. But Mr. Bray, he knew, he used it. He planned the forged codicil to be stored in the sealed records room, knowing it could be placed or removed at will without detection." "But why all the performance?" I asked. "Why not simply present the will and take the estate?" Holmes turned to me with a glint of satisfaction. Because the true heir was still unknown. There was a window of opportunity before the rightful heir could be located. Bray intended to use Drake, Cecil Merriweather, an actor of modest talent, as a placeholder. With his control over the documents and Merriweather's assumed identity, Bray could siphon the estate slowly, laundering funds through legal means. And the murder attempt. Miss Kettering, I believe, began to suspect the fraud. Her questioning of Drake's memories of Penbury unsettled them. Her knowledge of Penbury's daily habits made her a danger. Bray arranged for her to be silenced, using the passage to move his agent in and out without notice. Then why not simply remove the forged documents? I pressed. Because that would suggest guilt. He needed them discovered, accepted, and ratified. Their destruction would raise suspicion. Hence, the staged performance, the fire damage in the archive, the missing page in the logbook, the appearance of desperation. I exhaled. So Giles, the clerk, forged the will? Holmes nodded. Under coercion. A debt, no doubt. Bray had leverage. But even Giles grew nervous and fled, hence his initial disappearance. Holmes walked to his desk and retrieved a single folded sheet. He handed it to me. It was the letter Miss Kettering had brought us on the first day. You recall this? He asked. Yes, she said it was from Penbury. Holmes smiled. In a manner of speaking, it was in fact from Penbury's actual nephew, Michael L. Stone, the real heir. He had been estranged for many years but recently wrote to reconcile. That letter was intercepted by Bray and never delivered. Miss Kettering found it in Penbury's study weeks later and began asking questions. So Bray knew the real heir existed and acted swiftly to preempt his claim. But once we located Elstone, he's in Devon now, it was all over. The pieces fit, the ring, the forged codicil, the passage beneath the library, the false identity. He trailed off, then sat down. All that remained was to let Bray walk into his own trap, which he did. As they always do, Watson, when they believe the mask is more convincing than the truth beneath. We sat in silence for a time. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the gaslights had begun to shimmer through the mist. And now? I asked. Holmes stirred slightly, eyes unfocused. Now, he murmured, we wait to see how Scotland Yard bungles the paperwork. I laughed. But I shall ensure your name is remembered, Holmes, in full detail. He raised his brows. Then do, my friend. But be sure to leave in all the mistakes. They're what make it human. Chapter 17, Outcome and Justice. Word count, approximately 1,200. It was 2 days after Holmes had laid bare the intricacies of Mr. Bray's deception that justice, in its deliberate English fashion, finally caught up. A drizzling rain fell over London that morning, light and cold, with a persistent whispering patter that seemed to suit the business at hand. I accompanied Holmes to Bow Street Magistrates' Court, where the accused solicitor was to be presented before the Crown. Bray had been taken without incident from his townhouse the previous evening. He had offered no resistance, only a slight, contemptuous smile when confronted with Holmes' evidence and the arresting officer's warrant. A clever net, he had murmured as the manacles closed around his wrists. Though even clever nets tear under weight. At court, I watched him seated in the dock, his expression unreadable. He looked almost elegant in his restraint, the polished calm of a man who knew appearances mattered. But I also noted the fine tremor at the corner of his jaw, the only betrayal of the tension coiled beneath that cultivated exterior. Inspector Gregson, who had taken over the case after Lestrade's involvement, waned under the weight of its complexity, sat near us in the gallery. He leaned toward Holmes and whispered, "We've got Drake as well." He confessed everything: real name, fake inheritance, forged visits to the Penbury estate, and the clerk, Giles, turned state's evidence this morning. "It'll go quickly." Holmes merely nodded. "But here's the part I don't quite grasp," Gregson continued. "Why didn't Bray just take the inheritance himself? Why go through this Drake business?" Holmes's lips curled into something like a smirk. "Ah, Inspector. The law permits a solicitor to manage estates, not inherit them, especially when the family line is presumed intact. It would have raised immediate suspicions, but a distant relative, one with a vague past and a convenient face, could be ushered into society without much fanfare. Bray was never after the name. He only wanted the access." Gregson let out a low whistle. "You must admit, he's a sharp one." "He was," Holmes said, "until he met. Sharper." The proceedings were swift. Bray's own firm, now shamed and in disarray, had refused to represent him. A court-appointed solicitor sat beside him, green with discomfort. The clerk from the estate archives, Mr. Giles, took the stand first. He recounted the pressure placed upon him, debts acquired through gambling, quiet threats made in chambers, and finally the task of recreating Penbury's signature using ink provided by Bray himself. Next came Miss Kettering. Pale but composed, she gave testimony about the discovery of the codicil, her suspicions, and the subsequent attack in the library. When she described the gloved hand clutching the candle holder, Bray's own monogrammed leather, which she glimpsed only for a second, there was a sharp murmur in the gallery. Cecil Merriweather, the actor formerly known as Mr. Drake, followed. He looked visibly smaller than before, his shoulders hunched, voice subdued. He confessed to playing the role of heir in exchange for monthly payments, never questioning Bray's narrative. His remorse seemed genuine, and perhaps it was. He had not attempted murder, only deceit. Then came Holmes. There was a distinct hush as he approached the stand. I've often said that Holmes disliked public attention, but there was something in his manner when testifying, a poise, a crispness, that lent itself naturally to the role. He laid out the entirety of the case in meticulous detail, beginning with the forgery, the tunnel beneath the library, and culminating with Bray's efforts to eliminate Miss Kettering as a threat to the scheme. His voice never rose above a steady rhythm, yet each sentence struck the courtroom like a chisel against stone. And when I examined the ink used on the codicil, Holmes concluded, I noted its unusually slow oxidation, a chemical composition not available until last autumn. This document, therefore, could not have been written at the time claimed. That, Your Worship, is not theory but fact. The magistrate nodded gravely. A most thorough account, Mr. Holmes. The defense made no argument. Bray was remanded to await trial at the Old Bailey on charges of conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and perjury. His only words, as he stood to be led away, were spoken in a low tone to Holmes. You should have left the candle unlit. Holmes did not reply. Outside the courthouse, Miss Kettering waited beneath a black umbrella, her gloved hands tightly clasped. She greeted Holmes and me with a slight curtsy. I thought I should thank you properly, she said. You've saved more than just the estate, Mr. Holmes. You've preserved something of my uncle's dignity, something no one else seemed willing to do. Holmes bowed slightly. Your uncle was a man who guarded his privacy like a fortress. It was his misfortune that the enemy already lived within his gates. She blinked at that, then gave a sad smile. Will Mr. L. Stone be returning? He has already arrived, Holmes replied. "You shall find him an honourable steward of the Penbury name." "Then I think I shall leave London," she said after a moment. "I have little taste for city shadows now." Holmes offered his hand. "Then let the countryside welcome you with clean air and cleaner hearts." We parted ways shortly thereafter. As we rode in the hansom back to Baker Street, I reflected on the case. The forged will, the subterranean passage, the flickering candlelight in the library at Mile End. "You never told me," I said finally, "how you found the passage beneath the reading room." Holmes chuckled softly. "Watson, a good library always has its secrets, but only the truly desperate ever think to hide in them." Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. It was a week after the storm had passed, both the one that had battered London's skies and the one that had unseated a man from the quiet throne of lies he had built over 20 years in Mile End. I found Holmes by the window of our Baker Street sitting room that morning, his figure silhouetted against a grey and reluctantly brightening sky. He had not moved for some time, the morning paper unopened on the table, his fingers steepled and unmoving. "You've not even touched your tea," I remarked, as I entered with the latest from Scotland Yard. Inspector Gregson had written to inform us that Bray, now in remand, had instructed his solicitor to plead guilty to all charges save attempted murder. Holmes made no reply. His eyes remained fixed on the frost-glazed panes. "Are you satisfied, Holmes?" I asked finally, my voice quieter. "Justice was served. The estate is restored. Miss Kettering's name is clear." He turned slightly, his grey eyes meeting mine with something unreadable within them. Then, almost as if to himself, he murmured, "Strange, Watson. How even victory leaves. Its fingerprints in ash." I sat down, intrigued. "Ash?" He nodded, gesturing vaguely toward the fireplace, the remains of an effort. You see, Bray's plan wasn't built on greed alone. There was a peculiar artistry to it. The forged codicil, the fabricated heir, even the psychological manipulation of Miss Kettering, all elegantly orchestrated, however vile the intent. "You admire him?" I said, startled. "Admiration is too generous," Holmes replied. "But I recognize intelligence misapplied. And it is always a melancholy thing to see." He stood then and walked to the mantelpiece, where a small object sat. A stub of the candle that had once burned beneath the hidden trap-door in Penbury's library. "Do you recall, Watson, what Bray said as they led him away?" I nodded. "You should have left the candle unlit." Holmes turned the candle between his fingers. He was not speaking of literal light. He referred to curiosity, the one thing that ruins deception more thoroughly than justice itself. For 20 years, he had managed to orchestrate his surroundings so that no one asked the wrong question. Until Miss Kettering, with her wide eyes and deep doubts, arrived and did just that. "She was very nearly killed for it," I said grimly. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and she knew the risk. That is why, in the end, she belongs among the heroes of this tale. It was not my deduction alone that brought Bray down, but her refusal to believe the quiet lie." He dropped the candle stub into the hearth and returned to his chair. "You see, Watson, deception of that sort rarely begins with villainy. It begins with justification, an inheritance mismanaged, an opportunity glimpsed. By the time it becomes crime, the man has convinced himself he deserves the lie." I let that settle in silence. After a time I said, "What will become of the impostor?" "Merryweather?" Holmes waved a hand. "A month in jail, perhaps. A ruined career on the stage. But he will live, and possibly he will come to regret that his greatest performance was not in front of footlights, but under candlelight, in a room no audience was ever meant to see. "Holmes," I asked, "was there ever any real air?" He leaned back, his eyes closing. There was. A young man who died in a rail accident near Canterbury in '94. Bray had been one of the few who knew of his existence. With him gone, the path was clear. Miss Kettering was too remote in lineage to inherit by default, unless someone contested the will's terms. Bray ensured that contest would come from his own invention. And had you not exposed him? The estate would have passed smoothly to Mr. Drake, Holmes said. Bray would have managed the holdings behind the scenes, using the actor as a puppet. Eventually Drake would disappear, perhaps sailing for the colonies. Bray would remain unseen but omnipotent, a shadow inheriting the world. A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Mrs. Hudson with a letter. Holmes took it, opened it slowly, and read with his usual speed. A flicker of a smile passed across his face. "From Miss Kettering," he said. I waited. "She writes from Wiltshire. She has taken a small cottage overlooking a stream and intends to translate her uncle's journals, not for publication, only for peace, she says." He set the letter aside. "She includes no address." "Good for her," I said. "Some truths do not need to be shared." "Indeed," Holmes said, gazing once more toward the window. The morning light had strengthened. The fog outside had lifted just enough for the city to breathe again. Holmes rose and adjusted his cuffs. "Come, Watson, let us walk. The trees in Hyde Park may not weep in winter, but they do whisper." I laughed. "And what do they whisper, Holmes?" He paused, reaching for his coat. "That no lie, no matter how delicately arranged, can survive the cold scrutiny of reason forever." And with that, he stepped out into the street. I followed close behind.